Hello. Today we're going to explain what layers are in Photoshop. Many of you probably already experimented with layers. Some of you are already using them actively. But I want to give the people that are new to layers a little bit of history on how layers were invented and how we can use them to our advantage. The first thing that we want to do is maybe just go back in history. Walt Disney really, I would say, is probably the founder of the idea of layering images on top of each other. And he did this beginning with the full-length motion picture, the very first full-length animated motion picture called Snow White. It came out in 1937. It's just still an amazing masterpiece. But what he found lacking, despite the success of Snow White, was that it was kind of flat. Didn't have out of focus stuff in the foreground and out of focus stuff in the background. The kind of control that he saw in cinema with the use of depth of field and large apertures to make very tight selective focus, and that's what he wanted to accomplish. So he came out with a new technique, and it was called the use of plates. And we see this in Fantasia, which is basically a music video. There's no dialogue in Fantasia. It's classical music, very rousing soundtrack over animation. It was released in 1940. And what he did was he got glass frames, and then he would, they would have a glass frame with some foreground shrubs or something, and that would go in front of the camera, and it would be slightly out of focus. And then he'd have something in the background, which was another animation cell. It was usually glass or celluloid that was painted on in the background. And then in the midground, where the action was taking place, he would have this frame with these animation cells that he would change. So they would be at 24 cells per second, 24 frames a second, and that gave us the very smooth animation that we see in The Sorcerer's Apprentice and some of the amazing Disney animation techniques. Well, this use of plates was interesting, and he also had some motorized apparatus that would move the plates closer and farther away because there were no zoom lenses at the time. So he would zoom in the foreground and the background to make it look like the camera was moving. And it was shortly after that in cinematography they came up with zoom lenses, about 15 years later. But it was really Walt Disney that kind of was the genesis of that look of zooming. Well, anyway, let's get back to the Photoshop thing that we're talking about, and that is we don't call these layers that we have, we don't call them plates anymore, but that's where they came from. So I remember when Adobe was starting with Photoshop, they had not released it yet, they were just doing some groundwork, and I was a photographer in San Francisco that did a lot of special effects work. And one of my employees, who I have to really credit with doing a lot of the heavy lifting for these innovative techniques, his name is Mark D. Robertus. And so together what we did was we started to use that Disney technique. So we started using plates in front of the camera when we were shooting on location, mainly architecture, and we created these using pan masking film or just cutouts, or another thing that we used was this polarizing filter. So you can see that just one sheet of polarizing filter cuts the light down by 3/4, and you could add another one, but you could really attenuate it by rotating them, and you could cut it out to be almost black. So we were using these frames, cutting out little bits of it and shooting through that. That was good, but it was a little fuzzy. So we figured that the best thing to do would be to take the photographs and have different exposures, and then we would make prints, and we would put pan masking film on top of the negative between two sheets of glass, and then it would hold back certain areas. And we found that we could drop in clouds and a few other things, but it wasn't really sharp. It wasn't as sharp as we would have liked. So we used pan masking film underneath the enlarger. We would project the image down through these two glass plates, and they would have this neutral density material like this between there, and we would cut it out painstakingly to hold back certain areas, and that was good. We could change the exposure in certain areas, and it was a lot easier than burning and dodging, particularly on color. What we were projecting onto were 8 by 10 sheets of color film, usually transparency film, Ektachromes, very expensive, and that way we would do so many seconds here and so many seconds there and move the pan masking film up and down, and that was basically the very first of the layers. And then we'd run to the lab, get it processed, spend, at the time it was about $10 a sheet for processing, and we'd examine it, make some notes, make some adjustments, and we got some fairly good results, but they weren't super sharp. We wanted to be able to float things in the air and have products flying through the air, and we had a lot of clients, Macworld magazine, PC World magazine, and they were high-paying clients, and they really wanted to see special effects. This was, I guess, in the early 1980s that we worked on this technique, and we would create Kodalith masks that would be sandwiched between layers of our 4x5 transparencies in the enlarger, and so we got rid of that telltale line that a lot of people were getting in their special effects. And so it was basically this plate technology that Disney had invented, but we were just using it for projecting different elements onto a piece of 8 by 10 film, and that got really complicated. There were several images that we did for magazine covers and advertisements that took, maybe 16 or 18 different layers that were sandwiched together, and then they meticulously had to be exposed at the right exposure in the darkroom, one after the other. They had to be meticulously registered and to end up as one sheet of film, and often it would take 2 days of 10 hours a day just on the exposure of the film. We went through boxes of 8 by 10 film, and a magazine cover like you're seeing here, that we were doing that kind of work in the mid-80s, and that was a $15,000 job. Of course, now you could accomplish that in an afternoon if you had all the elements in Photoshop, but that wasn't what we had at that time. So now let's get back to how these relate to your layers. So what you are doing when you're creating a layer in Photoshop, I want you to imagine that you are looking through several of these plates, and they're just stacked on top of each other, right? And you can vary the plates. You can make some of them lighter, darker, more green, more red, whatever. They could have different images on them. Some of them could have a moon that's floating in the sky, a dark sky, or whatever. But the thing is that you can change the order of the plates, right? So you can basically, you could have one plate here, and then you could have another one below it or on top of it. And if you want this plate to be moved underneath the other one, you just select it and move it to the top, and you can accomplish that in Photoshop. Well, that is just amazing. How Adobe developed Photoshop was that they had the idea and they went to a bunch of photographers around the country, and since my studio was in San Francisco and Mark and I were doing this work, what they did was they came and observed us using plates, and they had a couple of technicians that were assigned to my studio, and they spent, oh gosh, they were there every day during the times that we were doing extravagant and complicated jobs. They would be there every day, all day, going into the darkroom, watching us, taking notes, taking photographs as needed to create a document that basically went through the process and documented what we were doing. And then they came out with some very basic features in Photoshop, but the real breakthrough was layers. They could, and also the cutting tool where you could mask something out and then put it on a layer, and you could put it above or below or whatever. And that was the genesis for the layers that we know. Since then, they've really become much more usable and user-friendly. There's a lot you can do with layers. The other thing that layers you can do, since you're looking through a layer onto another layer going down to the base, and there's no limit to the number of layers that you can have, the number of plates, that how Disney would describe it. But you can use the erase tool to just erase parts of a layer and make it just disappear or become kind of transparent. And so any kind of visual fantasy that you want to come up with is available to you by making these areas of slight transparency in a layer. So what I've done, and what not just me, millions of photographers have done, is they've used this technique as a way to enhance certain parts of the photo. And so what I'm going to show you is a very quick summation of how this would work to create a very good composite image. So that's the explanation, a very long explanation of what layers are. If you just envision looking through your layers onto the final image that would be at the base of the table, it would be a lot easier for you to see what the possibilities are and how you can rearrange them.